joining for the TechSpective Podcast. My guest this podcast is Nick Edwards. So Nick, if you want to introduce yourself and give a little bit of background.
Sure. My name is Nick Edwards. I'm the Vice President of Product Management at Menlo Security. I've been in cyber for, longer than I'd like to admit, a couple decades now. Prior to that, I was a submarine officer in the U.S. Navy, and it all kind of aligns with trying to help people stay safe from the bad guys. I'm happy to be here, happy to chat and share more about what Menlo's doing.
Awesome. So quick funny side story. But when you say you've been in longer than you'd like to admit, I mean, I've also been around longer than many, and but I had a call this week with someone who was giving me their background, and they said they're like, yeah, I've been in tech since the late '90s, and so I've just been around forever. I'm old, I'm 55, and he said this to me, and I'm going to turn 55 this year. And so I just let it go, but I was like, okay, I don't consider myself old. I mean, if you want to consider yourself old, knock yourself out. But
exactly. Speak for yourself, pal.
Right. Okay, so I've known about Menlo Security for many years. I've done some work with Menlo in the past, but let's kind of just start with some of the kind of the basics, the foundation of Menlo Security, and talk about what is an enterprise browser and how is that different from my normal Safari, Edge, whatever browsers.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we hear that a lot from customers. There's been so much news and noise in this category, which I think in many ways is great because it focuses people's attention on the fact that, hey, this browser that all of my end users use in my organization. I mean, it is probably the most heavily used app by everybody. But this thing was designed for consumer use. Realistically, this browser started as a toy to do things on the internet. And increasingly, as applications have modernized, it's become this vehicle to access, things on the web, whether you're using Salesforce, Workday, or private applications, et cetera. And I think what some of the downsides of all this marketing activity around this is kind of trying to encourage the world to say, hey, don't use this consumer thing anymore, use our thing. And that's better and more tuned for the enterprise. But that comes with some trade-offs. And our perspective is very different, which is, hey, look, there are certain use cases that need to be augmented and upgraded for enterprise use. And that means, applying access security policies, aspects of data security and making sure it's hardened to protect you from, internet threats. Our view is that you don't have to deploy a new browser to do it. You can deliver those capabilities via other form factors and other ways. That's what Menlo's vision is. Continue to use the browser you've been using, but make sure you have the adequate security capabilities around it. The broader category really speaks to taking this browser footprint and making sure it can address enterprise use cases. And I think that's what the category spirit is. There's just different form factors and ways to go after it.
Okay. Well, and one of the things that really resonated with me when I first learned about Menlo and talked with Menlo Security many years ago was, we talked about how the browser, like you said, and this was years ago, and it's definitely accelerated since then. But it is one of the most used apps, and at the time I was having this conversation, it was kind of towards the beginning of the rise of hybrid work, remote work, SaaS applications. But the more you have, if you're using Google Docs or you're using the web version of Office 365 as opposed to the desktop apps, and like you mentioned, with Salesforce and all these things you're all interacting through the browser, and the browser is designed to execute and render code. It's not like that's its sole function is to take the code that's given to it and act on it. It's not designed to protect you from anything. It's not designed to filter. I mean, yes, there are some security controls there, but at a base level, it's designed to run the code that it sees, which is obviously a big security concern. So with that in mind, let's talk about kind of your thoughts on why are browsers, why is the browser uniquely vulnerable? And like, can you talk about like some ways that you've seen them targeted in the past, like, like the sort of, I guess, threat vectors that people should be aware of?
Yeah, so I mean, I totally echo your perspective that browsers are designed to visit a server, take that content, render it so the user can see it, interact with it, and that's great for us as end users because it gives us a ton of functionality, but it's not designed for security. And unfortunately, with all of the broader security investments that we've made as an industry over the last decade, pick your acronym du jour, SASE, SSE, whatever. None of that is really designed to say, hey, look, the browser is this unique thing that it has to have a unique set of security capabilities for it. Like you said, like rendering the code, examining it, and then delivering security policy. There's a couple of attacks that we see relatively consistently that exploit this gap. Let's say the first of which is this technique that's used to deliver files to the endpoint. So traditional network security, as you're taking in a network traffic that may have malicious content, you have a web proxy, or maybe you have a firewall, or maybe you have a sandbox, and that's designed to say, hey, well, here's a file. Let me inspect that for viruses or malware, and then block it. That's great if you're downloading a file. Increasingly, we see content be delivered via basically JavaScript and HTML, and there's this term called HTML smuggling. So what's coming across the wire are bits that are JavaScript, and oftentimes it's encoded. So you really can't do anything to that content because it's designed to be executed on the browser. And what happens is when the browser gets that code and executes it, it turns into a file at that point, and then it's already on the endpoint, and you have to hope that your EDR, your endpoint, detects it. So that's one of these techniques that totally bypasses the entire network stack that's blind to, and it leverages the browser to deliver the end payload. Another example we see is around phishing. So for example, everyone thinks, well, phishing is this email thing that happens. And, I have an email gateway, I have an iron port in there. That's this great tool for identifying spam and phishing. Increasingly, we're seeing phishing attacks delivered directly via the web. A classic example that we see is one that uses SEO poisoning. So for example, someone may say, I'm searching for a user manual for some, networking device. And some bad guy out there has hosted some content on, a link that then gets poisoned via the SEO kind of algorithm. And instead of a user accessing a phishing link via an email, they're accessing it directly via the web. The browser may not have any of the capabilities in place to detect that it's a phishing attack, because they typically don't. And then next thing you know, the user's giving away their credentials. So the bad guys know how browsers are functioning technically, and they have a good understanding of the security stack in place. And it's like, all things, they're going to take the path of least resistance and find another way to exploit that hole. And they're using the browser increasingly to do that.
Okay. So all of that makes sense to me. One of the terms that I've seen kind of tossed around recently is the concept of highly evasive adaptive threats. So can you explain what is that, and what kind of adversaries do you see employing these tactics?
Yeah, so there's these highly evasive adaptive threats. That refers to this class of attacks that are being designed explicitly to bypass some of these kind of legacy security tools, like firewalls or proxies, or even some endpoint technology. They typically take advantage of the fact that a lot of security tools use kind of reputation-based systems to identify badness. And that implies that there is a patient zero out there who's already been impacted. That used to be okay in the old days. You could rely on that. But nowadays, where the stakes are so high and you have nation state actors, they may create an attack just for one target. Like that reputation-based system is not going to be effective. And similarly, kind of like with the leveraging of obfuscation increasingly with any kind of payloads, a lot of the legacy signature matching techniques for saying, hey, look for this trait of a badness, and then if I see it, I'll block it. That's increasingly being rendered as ineffective because you can't have visibility into some of these payloads. And then there are other techniques like bypassing the tools that are used for detecting some of this badness. So, I'm a iPhone user. I have iMessage connected to my laptop. I'm a Mac user. So I get the fish all the time that says, hey, your FedEx package is delayed. Click on this link. So I don't have any, tools in place to do that from my phone to my laptop. The only thing you have in place is the browser. So a lot of these techniques know this, and they're increasingly leveraging those to bypass. I think one of the more novel techniques that we've seen in the last, call it 12, 24 months, are these attacks that are bypassing some of the tools to deliver phishing links. So there's this technique called adversary in the middle. And this is essentially where an attacker creates a reverse proxy in front of the destination phishing site. So let's say someone says, they get a link to go to a LinkedIn login or a Microsoft Online login or something like that. These reverse proxies are delivering to the user the exact content from that target destination login page. So if you have a network security tool that is trying to determine badness, you can't, because this is the exact page. But this reverse proxy also intercepts the login information. So as the user goes to see, oh, this looks like a LinkedIn page or a Microsoft login page, they're actually sucking those credentials off when they get entered, and then the bad guys reuse those, sell those, or whatever like that, and then the customer's in a bad position. And that's an example of these evasive attack techniques that basically studying the bank that's being robbed. They know that the cameras are here, there, and everywhere. They know when the guard goes on their smoke break. They know to tell the teller not to lift the money tray that's going to set off the alarm. They're doing the equivalent of that on network security defenses all the time, and they're increasingly building tools to bypass that. And these evasive attack techniques, I think there's a Wikipedia entry for this, are designed to bypass that and to deliver payloads. And the most frequent use of this are very kind of maybe low volume types of attacks, but highly targeted for, almost in some cases, bespoke attacks against highly financial, laden targets or kind of nation state targets, whether they're military, governments, or otherwise.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I used to work at Cybereason. We focused a lot on ransomware. Obviously ransomware has been a huge, concern for everyone for years now. And, so I've focused on ransomware for a long time. And it wasn't until this year that I had this epiphany occur to me that we're always focusing on well, we need to stop ransomware. It's well, yes, but let's step back. It's the kind of the credential stealing, it's the phishing attacks. Those are the initial, that's the gateway drug. That's how the ransomware happens. It's so instead of focusing on, well, how do I stop the ransomware? It's well, no, just stop them from getting in the first place. It would be a better solution. And so along those lines, what do you see in terms of how pervasive are browser-borne threats, as an attack vector?
Yeah, I think we saw we recently published some research on this in January, and I think we saw almost a 200% increase in browser-borne threats over the last year or so, because of this very problem. And the firewall, that doesn't mean you don't need a firewall anymore. It doesn't mean you don't need a web proxy, but you need a different approach to protect the browser. It needs to be purpose-built. That's the way our industry has evolved. It's oh, well, maybe we can stop attacks by having a firewall. Okay, that worked until the bad guys knew they could just step over the firewall, And I think we're seeing the same thing with kind of legacy proxies and even endpoint solutions. So I think this pervasiveness of going after their credentials is where the bad guys are landing, because, at some level, software has, vulnerabilities, and, that's a thing that people can exploit and take advantage of. But the keys to the kingdom are the credentials. And so I think it's both these phishing type of techniques and, of course, social engineering, and potentially, we've seen sporadic developments around chatbot related, attacks to kind of augment social engineering attacks to get people to kind of release their credentials to the bad guys. So it's I think that's where the threat landscape is increasing in terms of the focus areas. And companies need to be really mindful of that, because ransomware, like you say, is almost like the second thing that happens after they get their credentials in a lot of cases. Yeah.
Well, and, to your point, one of the things that, has transpired over the last, 10, 20 years is, we went from the castle and moat perimeter defense, saying, well, you just need a firewall, you need a spam filter, and if you just block the outside world, everything inside's good. That evolved to detection and response, saying, well, you know what, that didn't actually work. They're going to get in. Now we need to be able to find them faster and respond. Also makes sense. Now we've evolved to, you know what, that's also not really working. We need like attack surface management and exposure management so that we can try to predict, what's exploitable and try to stop it there. And when I look at it, I say, okay, well, on the one hand, I agree with you. Like, it doesn't mean you don't get a firewall. It doesn't mean you don't get a spam filter. It doesn't mean you don't still use these legacy tools. Maybe they are taking out, I'm just gonna make stuff up. Maybe they're taking out 80% of the threats.
That's right. Yeah.
But you still need, now you're still spending money on this other 20% to find new tools. And so I agree. And I've always said, like, well, yeah, you still need your basic perimeter defense tools in place. Just like when Wi-Fi was first a thing, and very quickly they cracked the web encryption, and everyone went, well, I guess there's no encryption. May as well not even turn it on. And I was like, well, no, you can still turn it on, because if attackers are generally lazy and are going to go for the path of least resistance. So if you've got web enabled and your neighbor doesn't have web enabled, yes, they could easily hack yours, but they're not going to. They're just going to go over there. So by all means, do whatever you can to add a layer of defense. But at the same time, I would say, at some point, we do have to kind of like let go of some of these tools. Like, we keep saying, well, yeah, you should still have a firewall. Well, yeah, you should still have an email gateway. It's like, okay, but at some point, maybe you don't need that. I mean, we have new defenses, we have new technologies, and it's kind of like saying, being in like a town in the United States in 1900, and saying, well, yes, buy a car, but keep your horse and buggy just in case.
Yeah, that's and I think that dynamic is being felt by customers. I mean, with budgets being compressed,
right.
I mean, like every time we walk into a customer opportunity, one of the questions we get asked is, okay, this sounds really good. We think we need it. What does it replace? What can I not do?
Right.
And that's for exactly the reasons you mentioned, and financial reasons, and also, like, I think there's a spirit about security which I've always loved, which is typically best of breed wins, but that construct is also kind of facing headwinds of vendor consolidation, and exactly this point of like, well, I just don't want to add another best of breed thing that I got to cobble together with my existing tools. So some of these industry frameworks like SSE, et cetera, are designed to address that. But we've seen customers go down that path, and what they thought would be kind of, somewhat of a modest lift that could get done in, maybe 12 months is taking 18, 24 months, not delivering full value. And so I think those two issues are going to need to be reconciled as vendors and customers look at kind of how they want to address these things. And hopefully we'll get to a point where some of this stuff does allow these other legacy tools to get removed. But I think it's still kind of a journey in the customer mind to get there.
Well, and I think it's a problem both from the customer perspective in terms of, I mean, first of all, it's just easier to buy what you already have. It's easier to say, I have a firewall. It's approaching end of life. It's expiring, whatever. I need a new firewall. And they have a line item in their budget that says, this is how much we spend on a firewall. So it's easy to make that argument that you're going to go get a firewall. And also then you have like the analyst side of things, where Gartner says, well, these are the categories of products. And if you come up with something new and innovative and you say, well, I've got this tool and it's going to, I can protect you this way. They go, well, which box does it fit in? Which box are you in? And it's hard when you're not in one of those boxes. And I've seen vendors almost degrade their product. Like they go and retrofit some capability, where they're like, well, we don't fit in any of those boxes. And then they have to go through this exercise of stepping back and saying, okay, well, we're not able to get in the door with the customers because we don't fit in these boxes. We're not getting any traction with the analysts because we don't fit in these boxes. Which box are we closest to? Okay, let's go throw in some capabilities that like have nothing to do with our product and actually make it worse.
Yeah.
But they check boxes so that we can have a conversation where we say, oh well, we're vulnerability management. There now you have a line item that you can assign us to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've seen that, and it's like the analyst community is very influential, and there's some smart folks over there, no doubt about it. But in a lot of ways, they reflect what their clients are talking to them about, and they're not necessarily like always over the horizon type of folks of what's coming. And so I always caution people to you need to like any good strategist or someone steering the helm of the company, like you got to take in a lot of inputs. That doesn't mean they become your product manager. Like they don't own your roadmap. You have to own your roadmap. And I think an investor once told me, companies rarely die due to starvation. They die because of indigestion. They're trying to do too much. They do a crappy job at it. And their core thing that was great at this one thing was kind of junky at these other things. And next thing you know, they're in these opportunities. They get distracted. Their best product kind of gets underfunded while they're trying to develop these Me Too things just to slot into a category. And so I think a lot of those things come down to just having the right balance and executing, making sure you're just kind of staying true to your core beliefs and first principles as a company. And if you pick the right market, you got the right IP, the right team, hopefully you can make something happen.
Yeah. Well, and I would say in the same way that there's this like sort of inertia when it comes to security budgets and the things that organizations buy, there's also inertia on the analyst side. Like when they, I'm going to single out Gartner, but like, when Gartner creates a new Magic Quadrant, so after whatever, years of companies coming to them and saying, hey, but I don't fit in this box. They do finally get around to going, okay, well, let's make a new box. So now we've got this new Magic Quadrant. Here we go. Once they've established it and they say, okay, here's the criteria that we're analyzing this Magic Quadrant on. This is how we are defining this market segment, and these are the check boxes we're looking for. From that point forward, they're locked into their own legacy viewpoint of what that is, and not entirely. Like I think there are better analysts than others. It does depend on the individual to some extent, but for the most part, when a new product comes in, they just compare it against their check boxes, and they say, okay, well, you're not hitting my check boxes, and so they're also kind of stuck in their own legacy inertia and not looking at, okay, but how is this better? How is this different? Is this actually a better solution than this box of things that I have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why. I mean, one of the things that I missed during the pandemic COVID era, when people were just not meeting as much in person, was the fact that a lot of these events where there's like CISOs in the field getting together regionally, et cetera, they could swap stories of what's really working, what isn't, what problems are you trying to solve. All those things which are they appear like they're kind of marketing-ish boondoggles were actually really helpful for everyone to learn from their experiences. And in the absence of that, I think, nature abhors the vacuum, and people looked for other things to help guide them. And now I think we're seeing it kind of come back to a nice balance of, hey, here are these different constructs that exist in the market via analyst or whatever. How does that really work for our organization? What are you doing over there, Joe, at acme.com and Stephanie at whatever? And so hopefully I think the balance will be struck when people kind of start to map things to their environment, where they're going with their business, which is still transforming. Like it's funny. Like I was talking to a large bank last week, and they're looking at using Menlo's product to reduce their VDI footprint. And aspects of their infrastructure is still using 20, 30-year-old applications that are thick client applications, and they may not be modernized for another 5 to 10 years. So there's still a long journey. We live in our world in kind of a much more shorter horizon, but if you have a company that's doing billions of dollars of revenue and you want them to replace 50 apps, forget about it. It's going to take some time, and I think the industry needs to recognize that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of that, like going back to like Y2K, like anything that comes along where it's like, okay, well, we're all going to make this change now, and or look at the number of Windows XP systems that are still in production environments or whatever, where where organizations are like, well, I would upgrade, but I've got this application, whether it's a dentist office or an accountant or whatever, I've got this application that was designed to run on Windows XP, and whatever, maybe the company's out of business now and they don't, it's like so it's not just I need to switch from Windows XP to Windows 11. It's I need to switch from Windows XP to Windows 11 and find a new product and migrate all of my data over to this new product. And it's a heavy lift. Let's pull it back to the secure browsers. So if an organization is like, they say, okay, look, yes, the browser is, probably our most used app. We're doing all of this like sensitive business within the browser. We need to be more secure. What are the things that someone needs to consider when looking at a secure enterprise browser?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I mean, first and foremost, like I believe you got to put the user at the center of the problem, and we worked with customers, banks, organizations of all sizes, and oftentimes, like you and I may be technically sufficient. If our CEO said, "Thou shalt use this other browser," we may grumble, we may use it, but it would cause friction for us, and we're tech pros. Imagine if you're one of 300,000 employees at a large organization, and you have to suddenly use a totally different browser. Like there is friction, there is drag on that, and well, what about I need to use this one application that only works with Chrome or something. Like there's friction on having to replace those endpoints for the users. There's a learning curve associated with that, and not to mention the IT impact of having another endpoint to manage. So our first perspective is companies shouldn't have to replace their browser to use the browser for enterprise use cases. Second thing is, okay, well then how do I upgrade that to get the security outcomes I want? Menlo's approach is very different and very unique. We give customers, in a sense, a cloud browser that's secure. So instead of replacing Chrome, say keep using Chrome, send that traffic to Menlo's cloud, we have a cloud browser that in a sense acts on that endpoint's browser behalf to fetch the content, render it, and then you can apply policy as a security professional. And that policy means you can do things like control the bad stuff that comes in, but also provide policy for what applications they can access. And in so doing, customers, in a sense, get the best of both worlds. They can upgrade their browser on the endpoint to enterprise-grade capabilities. You can then you can employ security features off of the endpoint. So a classic example that a lot of the enterprise browser startups talk about is doing things like data security and data redaction. Well, in those cases, they're saying you have users accessing sensitive data. Instead of it appearing on their screen, we'll hash it out, we'll redact it. That redaction happens locally. Okay, well, maybe the average user doesn't know how to get access to that, but Jason Bourne will, or if there's malware on there that's rooted the endpoint that has access to memory, it gets that. With Menlo, all that enforcement happens in the cloud, so none of the sensitive data gets to the endpoint before there's a policy decision. And so that's a very critical aspect too. So this notion of you have a cloud browser, so you don't need to change the endpoint browser. The enforcement's happening in the cloud. And it basically mimics many aspects of the architectural model of legacy technologies like VDI. Like VDI at the time was pretty transformational because it allowed organizations to have a very clear demarcation of where the data sits, very kind of strong defensible postures of users being able to access that data. We deliver that same type of architectural model with our cloud footprint. And then on top of that, we can provide for application security, because in no scenario can a user's browser talk to the enterprise applications that are sensitive, because it goes through Menlo's cloud. Menlo's cloud browser is what talks to these sensitive applications. So if there is malware on the endpoint trying to execute, say, a log4j attack, which is basically modifying the user agent, our cloud browser doesn't pass that user agent on the endpoint. It provides sanitized HTTP sessions, so it provides this other layer of security. So I think when we talk to customers about it, we want to educate them on the benefits of don't introduce friction for your users, or as an IT team, don't introduce another piece of software you got to manage, you got to update when there are vulnerabilities in 0 days. Keep using Chrome or Edge. They have a lot of engineers at these companies keeping those things safe and hardened, but augment that with something that will allow you to implement security policy in a way off of the endpoint that protects the users and the applications from threats. And that's the architectural model that we think is best and that we try to evangelize and educate customers for.
Okay. Well, I wanted to go back to the thing you started with, which was the kind of the friction of, if I went into an organization of 10,000 people and I say, hey, guess what? No more using Edge, no more using Chrome. This is the tool we're using. People, inevitably, some percentage, probably 10, 20% will find a way around that. And you said, well, we as tech people would follow the rules or whatever. I could say that I'm guilty of having not followed the rules, and specifically with PCs. Like when I've had, when I've been in full-time roles at Tenable and Alert Logic and Cyber Reason, et cetera, the company has always issued me a laptop. Like, hey, here's your company laptop, and I'm always like, yeah, I don't really like your laptop. I've got this really nice Surface laptop that I really like, and so I've always used my own, and actually, the things that we've talked about, the focus on the browser makes that easier for me to get around, honestly, because, years ago, it would have been like, well, no, we're issuing you software. You have to use this software to get your job done, and we're only going to put that software on our computer, and we're going to lock your ability to add other software. But once you kind of pull all the tools into the browser, it's like, well, you can't block me from using the browser. I have to get my job done. And once you give me access to the browser, well, now I can pull in all this other stuff and I can do what I want. And so, so I've always done that. And one of the last, I think it was when I was at Alert Logic, I had I was, friends with the head of IT. And at some point I'd been there a couple of years and I said, do you want this laptop back? I'm like, I've got this laptop in my desk drawer that you guys gave me that I've never used. And he was like, I'm just going to pretend we didn't have this conversation. And he turned around and walked away.
It's like, la, 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 la.
Yeah. He was like, I don't want to know that. So, it's just, and it's just the way it is. And you look at the whole, the shadow IT problem. You've got, everyone's out there using, sending their data to Dropbox. Mm-hmm. They're, uploading sensitive documents to ChatGPT. There are, users are going to find ways around the controls to an extent. So I think the way that you've described this architecture makes great sense to be like, all right, well, you know what? Knock yourself out. Use Edge, use Chrome. But we've got this kind of cloud proxy that's going to kind of, sit in the middle and help protect you from yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in many ways, it's like the browser is the next gen workspace. It's like, increasingly more and more things are going to be done via the browser. And to your exact point, like, wow, a browser can exist on any form factor, any computer, on your phone, on your BYOD laptop. And as such, what we see customers trying to do is take a step back and say, hey, look, this SASE SSE thing was great for network transformation, but it really didn't address the issues of my workspace. And I need to upgrade my workspace. VDI is becoming too expensive. Like you mentioned earlier, hybrid work, everyone's everywhere on different laptops, different endpoints. Customers, the holy grail is a more consistent policy model that doesn't require bespoke implementations and solutions for, a gazillion different use cases. So, you have contractors or third parties. How can I treat them in a way that is with a consistent policy model of my managed endpoints? And the unifying thing here would be kind of this browser-based access to these applications that these people are using. So if companies are looking to architect for the future, they should architect around what does the workspace look like in the future, probably around the browser, different users, different personas. How can I align an architectural model that gives a comprehensive security approach without introducing 10 different solutions that, if I'm using the same data security infrastructure, how can I apply it to these use cases and all these different things? And I think that's where we see some of our leading customers, kind of partnering with us on, is to help them navigate that journey with kind of a different approach.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it just, like I said, I think it does make sense, because I had never really thought of it before, but when I do step back, I say, well, you know what, there are a lot of things I can access through the browser, and because I'm because I've been around a while and I'm more old school, like I still greatly prefer the desktop version of the Office apps. It's like when something opens in the browser, the first thing I do is say, you know what, open that in Word. I don't want to be over here. But a lot of stuff is just done in the browser, and obviously that's an issue. One of the other things that I've seen mentioned and have talked about in the past is this idea of the importance of like browser context, for security. Can you elaborate on that some?
Yeah, definitely. So, like with browser context, you can see everything that the user is doing, how they got there, how that informs the security policy enforcement, what they're doing on the page, et cetera. So, if you think, just to nerd out a little bit on like something like a web proxy, like a web proxy is in a sense a stateless thing, right? It's like, call response, client server, get this, okay, cool, then do this, then do this. From a real-time perspective, like the proxy can't do a lot with context because each one of these sessions is kind of a point in time. Now, so as an industry, we've done things like, hey, well, let's dump some of this telemetry from logging, et cetera, into a SIM, and then we can do some things. But that doesn't typically have as strong a real-time enforcement capability, like at point of click, so to speak. With the browser, a great example of context is, things like redirects. Like I see attack techniques all the time that starts on, a document that has a link in Google Docs that then the user clicks on it. Next thing you know, there's like 3 or 4 redirects, and you're landing on a page hosted on the other side of the planet that's giving you a phishing input page or something like that. And so those are examples of context that helps make better decisions. Another example, kind of to the ransomware case, is with like how a file gets delivered to the end user is a very critical signal for understanding, like what happened, and so having context of like what was the JavaScript doing, kind of what were the tags that were being used to actually deliver a payload. Those are other things that provided in context can give you a better signal in the broader signal to noise ratio for providing enforcement. And this also has very important implications for incident response. So when you look at the evolution of forensics tools and incident response tools, like from the endpoint, for example, like back in the day, endpoints didn't have much forensic capabilities. Then as they started getting infected and impacted, a market cropped up to deliver IT teams. Hey, here's what happened. Here's what the registry, looked like after this thing got installed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Browsers don't have any of that. So we've recently introduced a product that allows customers to have complete forensics of users' web sessions. So, for example, based off of policy, a customer can say, hey, whenever there's a phishing attack, keep all that web traffic, send it to my, Amazon repository where I can see screen by screen what the user did. I can understand what credentials were delivered to the web page, so then I can execute my playbook as needed. Or maybe it's someone on an employee watch list, or maybe it's just a privileged user, or maybe whenever someone goes to a private application and there's a piece of sensitive data being accessed, you trigger the policy so you can make sure they're not downloading and then uploading to Gmail or something. All that is very important feature-rich context that is really hard to stitch together otherwise. What are you going to do? You're going to have to get endpoint logs, correlate them with proxy and firewall logs, and maybe in some cases we've had customers use PCAPs to try to stitch together what someone did. All that's available in the browser, but you got to get it, you got to store it, you got to synthesize it and present it to the team who's trying to use it. And those are very important, aspects of telemetry, not only for enforcement, but also for incident response.
So the way you describe that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the browser context sounds like a variation of behavioral analytics. It sounds like a variation of saying, look, I kind of know what Tony usually does or what the browser usually does. I know the browser connects to these apps, it accesses this data, and and I want to be able to know that it's doing those things, but I also want to be able to identify like anomalous activity to say, okay, well, why is Tony Bradley's browser doing this?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. I'll make the example very real for you. So, since our secure cloud browser renders all the end user browser content requested in the cloud, we have complete context and visibility to do things. So we see what we call 0-hour phishing attacks, which are brand new attacks that are bespoke to go after so-and-so at some company. What we've built in our product is basically we've turned into software what a human threat researcher would do. So the page gets rendered in our cloud. We have that context. We use computer vision, which basically looks at the page, and we've applied AI and ML to say, well, what would a human do if they're trying to determine that this is phishing? Well, first, they would see, well, is there a logo on there that's trying to trick the user into trusting it? So our computer vision models say, look for the logos. Okay, wow, here's a logo. Look it up in our database of all these different logos that are frequently used. It could be customer logos that they provide for us. Okay, we got a logo. Since we're also rendering that page in our cloud, we have the context of the DOM and the HTML and all that stuff. So we say, are they asking for passwords and usernames? That coupled with a logo would say this is definitely a login page. And then we apply the context of what the URL is. Is this a brand new URL that has a Microsoft login? That page looks just like a Microsoft login page. That's probably something you shouldn't trust. That's the kind of context that is really not available with web proxies, especially as web pages are being kind of dynamically generated, they're obfuscated and all this kind of stuff. It's combining kind of that context with a behavioral understanding of what a user is trying to do to provide policy enforcement. And the beauty of this is you don't need a pre-existing verdict on the content. You don't need someone to say, hey, this URL is bad. You can figure this out in real time because you have the real-time context and you have kind of these advanced techniques to be able to, make an application verdict.
Awesome. All right. Well, so I don't have any more questions, but I did want to, I just had this thought occur to me that in my drawer to my left in my desk, I have a collection of various, stress ball type things that I've collected over the years from, RSA and Black Hat and stuff. And I have this here Menlo Security light bulb, foam stress ball from, I don't know, 2011, 12, somewhere in there.
Old school.
But it's a good shape for stress balling.
No, that's great. No, that's so you met us in our early days. I think our CEO loves the light bulb, but the logo has kind of evolved a little bit since then. The whole idea of the logo is kind of like, that bulb is kind of like I say, it's partially just kind of illuminating, things to the security team, but also allowing the users to not have to process all the security stuff. Take the user out of the security equation. Let the salesperson be the best salesperson. Let the software developer be the software developer of best in class. We'll keep tackling the security stuff for you. And so it's meant to kind of imply that we can allow your users to be the brightest light bulbs they can be. We'll kind of relieve them of the burden of really trying to be kind of a security professional like we are.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you for taking the time to join me. I think it was a pretty good chat. So thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Nice connecting with you, Tony. Take care.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow @TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.